Thank you for people's comments. It's good conversation. So what we have to come to recognize then is there are differences through this history where it's not exact fractals, and I think we're already familiar a little bit with that concept. So when you have the 144,000 is our template model, it's this. When did the 144,000 join the movement? You know it's prior to the harvest. When did the Gentiles join the movement at the end of ancient Israel? In the harvest. That all makes sense if you're willing to drop down the whole history and see that this is not a perfect fractal, but there's differences between the groups because they are different. Brother Russell, it is the same methodology of manipulation used by FFA, saying that the Jordan is Paneum, then saying they are expecting the second messenger in the future at the Jordan. Yes, they have taken these histories and they've manipulated, stretched them, cut them up, condensed them. And when you do that, you start making wrong applications, dangerous applications. A question, so you can't really fractalize the details, only the structure. But sometimes you can fractalize the experiences like Jacob's time of trouble. Is that correct? So we are fractalizing a basic structure. What we particularly have is a repeating pattern. Ploughing, early rain, latter rain, harvest. That's fractalized. What we have fractalized is increase of knowledge formalization test. So the dispensations are fractals. The testing time in them is fractalized. That is the fractal. But there are details within that history that are not fractalized, if that makes sense. There's a fractalized structure. That helps us to see why there are differences in this history. You can't have the Gentiles coming in their ploughing time. What are the disciples going to teach them prior to the cross? In fact, many people right now are worried because in this history, in the early reign of the Levites, between 14 and 19, they were telling Levites that Donald Trump is the last president of the United States, and now people feel shaken that they might have been wrong. What do you think the disciples were telling people in this history? And now the disciples have to go to those same people at Paneum and apologize, don't they? That's the problem with dealing with real life events. We can talk about being hidden, but in reality, hidden can only go so far. We're not in an isolated bubble. I'm pretty sure that Peter, now I'm dealing with a fictional story, when he goes back to the church at Pentecost, or he goes to the Gentiles after 34 AD, he runs into the cousin of the man whose ear he cut off. And he's going to say, I know who you are. You thought you were going to overthrow Rome. In fact, you cut off my cousin's ear. Their mistakes and their training is visible, even though we can call that a hiding time period, even though that there is this layer of protection. Our training time period, which we have been and still in, is a time period when we have to unlearn mistakes. That was a side point. So I've discussed before about this top line being like a body. So the lines are quasi-fractals. Yes, Sister Adriana, it's like what 𝗂𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗏 said. We had it very simplified to help us understand, but now we are getting more detail. Yes, and I don't think that more detail is necessarily more, it doesn't have to add a painful degree of complication to our message. It's what we've understood for some time, even when it comes to the difference between when the 144,000 join in comparison to when the Nethinims join. We've always been dealing with quasi-fractals. And it's a manipulation of that history that is not another viable way to look at that history, but a dangerous manipulation of it. What is fractalized is the ploughing, early rain, latter rain, harvest. The understanding of that they have a time of the end where their testing begins. That there is a Sunday law here that's progressive to Daniel 11:41. That there is a shut door and a testing and a time of trouble. All of that becomes fractalized. But the details of the individual experiences of those groups, there are differences in. So the disciples are devastated at the cross. They've been forced to come to grips with not only that the nature of the kingdom is different to what they thought, but also they don't understand what just happened at that event. And they are afraid. You can't fractalize that to 2009. The cross does not fit there. I've wanted to do this first before addressing this question that quite a number of people have raised about the study of the internal and external change of leadership in 2014. So I might erase this work. So you go to our other reform lines and you see that there's a change of leadership at that middle way mark. If we were to properly investigate the line of Moses to Joshua, we would see that, I'm sure. We've already touched on that. If we were to go to the end of ancient Israel, we see that solidly here when we go from John to Christ. We see that already with our history, our Millerite history, when it goes from Miller to Snow. And there was a study done in the last 2 years which showed the external view of that. That we went, if I dealt with external and internal, that we went from Obama to Trump. And we went from 𝗂�57 to 𝗂𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗏. The internal and the external. And what waymark did we place here? 2014. Did we care that Trump was not then even running for president? No. It's funny when, it's not really funny, but people can be really comfortable with a thought until they start feeling disenfranchised, and then they can start to have trouble. The people who've asked this question, I'm not saying that of them, but I'll explain that in a little while. 2014, we've marked as a change of leadership, and we see that going from Obama to Trump, but we see a transition in how that becomes visible. It's already changed in 2014, but it's going to progressively become visible. And to simplify that, we saw that in 14, but then in 15, externally, Trump is campaigning. 15, internally, 𝗷𝗴𝗴𝗲𝗿 begins teaching. 16, Trump is elected. 16, internally, 𝗷𝗴𝗴𝗲𝗿 is anointed. And you could trace that all the way through to 2020. And we saw that 2014 was the change of leadership. It takes time to become visibly recognized and established, but it's already occurred in 2014. It is the turning point year. Just to repeat myself, we saw the external transition from Obama to Trump. It takes time for Trump to be established. Internally, we saw the transition in leadership from 𝗷𝗴𝗴𝗲𝗿𝗃 to 𝗷𝗴𝗴𝗲𝗿. It takes time for that to be visibly established, but it was concretely changed in the eyes of God in 2014. And it's the fault of the movement of the people, how slowly they come to recognize and implement that change. 2014 is the turning point. It's here. Transition of leadership. Sunday law, waymark for the first group called. We saw that John's methodology was no longer fit for purpose and there was a transition. Going back to the studies done in Uganda, the Levites. Not going into who's leading them, has been leading them. Who leads the Levites now, today? Which is pretty much saying the whole of the Adventist movement church. Someone says our movement. Sister Linda says we do. From what waymark? From 2019. Do they yet recognize it? Do the Levites recognize it? No, it takes time for them to recognize what has already taken place. The veil of the temple was torn November 9, 2019. There is no presence of Christ in the sanctuary ministering to the Jewish nation. It's come to a concrete end. All it's going to take is for Pentecost for people to be told that. Down here, at Pentecost, at the same time, we're going to the Levites, who now leads the Nethinims. We do. They don't recognize it yet. They don't see it yet. They're not going to see it at Pentecost. It takes time for them to understand that, learn that, and accept that. So at every point when we personally recognize that change of leadership has taken place is after God has already established that. So, change of leadership 14, this is the movement. Then that movement, this movement, takes over leadership of Adventism, the Levites. Then that combined movement takes over leadership of the Gentiles, of the Nethinims. 34 AD, what's the change of leadership? What's the change of leadership in 34 AD? Not the event. Someone says Jews to Christians. I'm not sure if they've changed their name, but they have the same. Someone says Paul. First of all, Paul is a Levite, and then when Paul is in Jerusalem and the disciples come together and say, you need to go to the temple, and he says, I don't want to, and they say, you need to go to the temple, what does he do? He goes to the temple. Why? Because however much we build up Paul, he's in submission to the leadership. He does not take over the leadership of that movement. He does as he's told. The whole reason he ends up in prison is because he did as he's told. He answered to his bosses. He's just a larger-than-life character. John in charge of Gentiles. John is a symbol. At this point in time, who is John in 34 AD? Not referring to the 7 deacons. That organisation is becoming more established. They're getting better organised. But where is there a transition of leadership from one leadership to another leadership? In the 144,000 themselves. What I want to suggest everyone is doing is trying to use an absolute fractal. There is no change of leadership for the 144,000 at the Sunday law. You have a change of leadership internally in the movement here. Then that movement takes over leadership of the Jews. Then that movement takes over leadership of the Gentiles. But in 34 AD, it's the same disciples, the same leadership that are doing that work, that are leading. John the Revelator, he's over here as a symbol of the 144,000, but back here, he's one of the leaders of that movement, and he has been a leader for quite some time. There is no internal change of leadership at the Sunday law. Does that make sense? There is no reform line where you can see that. There is no model of the 144,000 history when you can see that. Silence in the chat group. Sister Charity and Brother Blessing say that's clear. Sister Linda says there are no more shakings after this. It's a question. If you hope so, I will hope so. I believe there will be shakings all the way to the second advent. But they won't have the same characteristics or the same nature. People are saying it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, please say so. The major transition in leadership that happened at the end of ancient Israel, it's all about this waymark. If you go to any history, this is the cross. If you told anyone, atheist, Adventist, Pentecostal, go to the New Testament and name the singular waymark that stands out above any other, they will take you to the cross. 2019 has that characteristic. It's October 22. It's this history, 14 to 19, that has it's the history of the Gospels and the beginning of Acts. That is what is given so much time and attention. That is when there is this great transition in leadership that sets the scene for everything that comes after. Internally, everything comes back in a special sense to that history. Not just internally, but externally. This is the history of 1844. 1844 set the, I hope we might have got that point a little from the last camp meeting. 1844 was the turning point that set the United States on an irreversible course to the Civil War. It all comes down to that transition. When Polk was elected, the Civil War became inevitable. It all comes down to Polk. Regardless of what comes after Trump, if someone is elected in 2024 after a second term, regardless of who comes after, the course is irreversible. You can't go back and unseat 3 members of the Supreme Court. Does that make sense? You can't put QAnon back in its box. You can't undo the conspiracy theories, the destruction of the Republican Party, the destruction of the judicial branch, The work is done. Now all that we're going to see is the result of that work. I'm not saying we're not going to see significant events and changes. Someone asks, when do the Nethinims change leadership from AOC and Michael Moore? Good question. I would suggest it's at their middle way mark, which lines up for us with 2021. And why do they need to change in leadership? Why do they need to change? Because the leaders compromise, because they have errors too. They learn from us. I agree that first angels work, if we can use it in that external sense, they're using wrong methodology, they don't understand the nature of the kingdom of God, and they're no longer fit for purpose. In fact, in our history, that became evident in 2012. We already need to recognize that the great work that has been done by these external forces, if Nethinims can no longer safely trust those people to lead them, we should have a reasonable caution ourselves when we look at their methodology and their actions. Half right and half wrong. Irreversible, not irrevertible. Apparently that's not a word.
It is a word.
Okay, someone says it is a word, so it is a friend of my mother's and you can argue afterwards. Someone says they don't understand equality. I would suggest they don't correctly understand it, which is why they have done their work and there will be a transition. Can we mute? So we have the 3 fractals. They are quasi-fractals. I erased that. One more. So they're quasi-fractals, they're not concrete, they're not absolute fractals, and we can't manipulate, cut up that history. We may see another reform line built with a different theme, such as Christ in his role as priest, that's going to give us a neat view, but we can't take even that history and start to cut it down and manipulate it. So we come to this model. This study is showing this key change of leadership. We're not going to see another change of leadership like it, not internally, and I would suggest externally as well. Not in the sense that there's going to be that that degree of destruction due to US institutions. That work is already set on its course. What comes after is already irreversibly set. So when we come back to this study, the question that people have asked, again, I'm saying it's honest questions. I know these people. So if Trump is not the last president of the United States, if there is another president after him, and after, what does that do to our internal model? My answer would be the following. Our reform line began in 1989. Who's leading it in 1989 internally? 𝗷𝗵𝗴𝗲𝗏. Who's leading it externally in 1989? You have Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., and then Obama. Prior to 𝗷𝗵𝗴𝗏, did we have 4 sequential leaders of the movement? No, we didn't. It was 𝗟𝗏𝗃 all the way from 1989 through to 2014. Externally, it's not the same. You have president after president after president after president. We took Obama as a symbol. We saw all that he represented. We saw this movement that would take us to the Sunday law, Trump, all that he represented, and we made an internal and external application of that history and applied it to 2014, but really to that whole dispensation. So I would suggest that we should not discard that study and its application, because there may be a V, a C, a B and an R after Trump. What that external model is designed to do is give us that key transition in leadership. That is key, not only internal but external, in a different fashion. Does that make sense?
What about the Catholics?
The Catholics? I'm going to leave the counterfeit study for another day, if that's okay. I think we have more to understand there as well. I don't know what that is, so I'm not trying to surmise. But they've had an interesting history. I hope everyone's been following what has occurred over the last 2 weeks. The true and the counterfeit model is still holding weight, and the organisation within that counterfeit structure it is certainly being worked on in this history. So over the last 2 weeks, I hope we all have been seeing the working of Pope Francis and his cleaning up of mess inside the Vatican. So if it's okay, Sister Marie, I might leave the study of the counterfeit though to another study. So we have...
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. We have the external and the internal. It's all designed to show us this transition in leadership. 2014 is when that takes place, regardless of how long it takes people to recognise that fact. And it sets the course for what must inevitably come after. 𝗟𝗏𝗃 was the leader from 1989, regardless of changes in the US presidents. 𝗟𝗏𝗴𝗲 will continue to be a leader regardless of changes in the US presidents. It's not a model that's broken by that. If it isn't broken before, it's not broken in the history after. We would have to be consistent if we're going to say that this election shows a change of leadership here. We would need to be consistent and start going to prior elections and doing the same thing. Someone asks, do we have that long to go? We thought we were so much closer. I really can't surmise about that. Millerite history, 1844, they had another 16 or so years. From the 1844 to 1850 history, which we're in now. We have a lot of work to do, which is, as 𝗟𝗏𝗴𝗲𝗏 said in the last camp meeting, is dependent also on our own willingness to partake in that. So this is questions that naturally come to people's minds, so I hope that becomes clearer. I've wanted to begin by demonstrating what type of fractals we're using and how we're using history. We're not extending it, we're not condensing it, we are taking it as it lays, as it's laid out in the Gospels, as it's laid out in Acts, and we're applying that to our own. We're doing the same with Millerite history, and when we come to it, we will do the same with the history of the beginning of ancient Israel, Moses and Joshua. We've seen that there are differences, that there is a structural fractalization, but there are different details through that history. And That applies in the change of leadership, it applies when people join the movement, etc. There are these changes. We can see that in Millerite history. They have a great disappointment at this waymark. It doesn't mean that at 1850 there was a great disappointment and a mistake made by Nethinims. They didn't make a mistake in 1850. So that doesn't go from fractal to fractal the same way either. When you say extend or condense, are you speaking to progression? That was a question. So, I'm not sure if I quite understand the question. When we're talking about, when I say extend, or I would say it's cutting up the history. So if one of the points that Elder Jeff made in the shaking last year was that he said that the work of Elder Parminder and myself was what was it in the history of Moses that he used? What event? When the man and the woman are together and Moses, the apostasy at the Jordan. And what mistake did he make? If you have a line of history that begins with the birth of Moses, and I won't address when it ends, then that apostasy with the Midianites happens here. And when Elder Jeff said it was happening over here, where we were in 2019. And at a quick review of that history, it would make more sense that this actually occurred in 2014. So he's going to take this event and he's going to stretch it over to the current shaking. The problem is you have to wrench it from its history. Does that make sense? That's what I mean when I say manipulation. It's this use they have of history that makes them come up with error after error after error in their message, not just recently, but going back into the time period when they were among us, that caused so many problems and misunderstandings in this movement. So we're out of time. That's been dealing with one question. Next week, we won't then go back to Millerite history. I want to address a couple of other questions I was hoping to do today, but we're out of time. And I'm sure Brother Luke wants all the time that we can give him. So I will make one point, since he's generously offered. I will make one point. I said at the beginning there are honest questions and there are dishonest questions. And what we've had recently with the shaking that we've experienced, particularly in Eastern Africa, particularly focusing in 𝗂𝗃𝗄, there are 4 men who particularly led in that shaking. And one of those brothers contacted me a little while ago. And I actually spoke in the presentation without naming him, but what he had sent me. And what he had sent me, in those messages he stated that he had stopped watching anything I presented. Hadn't watched before, would not watch now, because he says I'm doing nothing but repeating the same thing over and over and over again. So prior to a private or public split, what always happens first is people stop watching. And that is such a dangerous thing to do. That's what Elder Jeff did months before August and September of 2019. That's what these brothers did months before August, September of this year, when the shaking began to be addressed more concretely. And in that, these 4 brothers, what they have done is, as leaders in 𝗂𝗃𝗄𝗏 refugee camp and in their own capacity outside 𝗂𝗃𝗄𝗏, there are people who depended upon them for access to presentations, and they were given the opportunity to download and share presentations, and they decided of themselves to not only stop watching, but also they were preventing other people watching. So you have a large amount of people, innocent people, victims of this shaking, who are losing access to our presentations. At the same time, these brothers are preventing them, holding back our presentations from them. And in that context, they start to ask the following questions. So when 𝗷𝗃𝗃 finally left this movement in September 2019, he could not land a solid blow on the Midnight Cry message because he didn't even know what it was. He didn't even understand it to such an extent that he could attack it. But I made a point at that camp meeting in 2019, in September, when 𝗷𝗃𝗃 leaves, what he is saying is he disagrees with our message of equality, of the Sunday law, etc. But what he does say is that he believes in Acts 27. He believes in World War I, World War II. He says they're structurally sound models. He believes in time setting. He believed in all of that. And what was said at that German conference, the prediction that was made, was if he rejects this message, he's not just going to reject our understanding of the Sunday law. He's going to go back and he's going to reject our understanding of 2016, of the Republican Party and its responsibility for the Sunday law. He's going to go back and reject World War III, that entire model. He's going to go back and reject 2014 as the Sunday law. He's going to go back and reject 2012 as time setting. And from September to July this year, their message was entirely based on time setting. We said at the German conference, they start rejecting this, it's like a Jenga puzzle. If we know what they are, it's like that thread of a garment. You pull it, you lose everything. And these brothers, these four brothers who've led out, not only choosing to not follow the messages themselves, they've blocked and prevented others, and that will be fearful in the judgment. What the questions they are asking are questions such as, how can the work of Cambridge Analytica be the Sunday law of 2014? How much more have we understood 2014 in the recent weeks? The judicial branch, the legislative branch. We say that the leadership changed in 2014. 2014 is a midterm election. Why were the Republicans able to block Obama in the last 2 years of his presidency? In that midterm election, they win the greatest Republican majority in Congress since World War II. They take Congress in 2014. They're already controlling legislation. That party took control in 2014 without Trump. So when they say that our understanding of the Sunday law in 2014 is weak because all they can remember and attach to it is Cambridge Analytica, they not only have started to destroy their own faith, not just in the message of equality, not just in the Midnight Cry, they're already undoing World War III. They've long undone equality. They're now undoing 2014 and the Sunday law. It won't be long before they lose time. And the fearful thing is they're not just responsible for their own souls. There are victims and casualties of their actions that never needed to be victims and casualties. And that's what we find confronting ourselves today. So that's what I meant when I said there are honest questions. This is an honest question. I'm not challenged by people wondering about a change of leadership. What is not an honest question is when people stop watching presentations, start rejecting the conclusions of the midnight cry, and then unraveling what has been formally put in place, those waymarks which are rock solid. 2014 cannot be moved. Every investigation of it only makes it more and more sound. But when people begin, and they begin by ceasing to watch presentations and join with us in those studies, they begin with that action. Piece by piece, as Elder Jeff did, they lose everything that they've ever gained before. So in the next Sabbath, we're going to have one more Sabbath going over some questions. We do understand that the LGC ministry has a camp meeting coming, and we will use opportunities to go back and look at Millerite history. But if other people have questions or thoughts they want to add with the absence of schools, we need to have this opportunity to speak, to give voice together. So I hope I was blessed by everyone's input. Thank you. If you kneel with me, we're going to close in a prayer. I'm sorry for going over time. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for how you have led and guided. We know, Lord, that we have much to learn, and yet we see what you have taught us. And I pray if anyone looks at these messages and sees a lack of love, that their eyes might be opened. We pray for those in Adventism who are looking at chaos, at pain, at the whole world in revulsion, and have no explanation except to think that maybe you are a deist God. Maybe you don't care enough to be involved, to talk to us and tell us what's happening. We know you do care. I pray for those, Lord, who through no fault of their own are having the truth withheld from them. I pray that the light will shine into those places, that as many as possible might be reached with those this movement's message, and as many as possible who have understood it and are finding that that light is being withdrawn from them by the stranglehold of others, that they might find another avenue, another access to that light, that they might be saved. I pray that everyone will feel their individual responsibility in whatever capacity we can to share that light, and also, Lord, to share it with an understanding of correct organisation through the model of a correct organisation. Please help us in this process as we battle with so much in this dispensation. I put this movement in your hands, Lord. It is yours. You will lead it to success, but as Elder Parminder taught us in the last camp meeting, we don't just pray for success. We pray for overwhelming success in the number of souls saved. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.